This is KM Weiland, and you are listening to the 451st episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. Since I have been commenting a lot lately on the fact that I'm working on finishing first round edits on my Portal Fantasy sequel Dreambreaker, someone asked me what this early editing process looks like for me. These days, because of the work I put in upfront on outlining, my first drafts are usually pretty structurally solid. So this means I don't generally have to do any major rewriting in my initial edits. So these edits, which are 3 rounds, happen right after I finish the first draft, before I send the book on to my beta readers and editors. And really at this point, I'm just tidying up the manuscript before sending it on. The first of these 3 edits is, as I've mentioned, primarily about tightening word count. The second, which is what I'm still working on right now, is about polishing prose and snipping off any ragged ends that happened due to the cutting and trimming in the first edit. And the third and final of these initial edits is strictly proofreading. I will get my computer or Kindle to read aloud to me while I read along, so I can hopefully give my betas as clean a copy as possible. And then I get to take a break from it for a while. In other news, let me say that today's podcast is sponsored by Damonza.com, the excellent company who produces all of my book covers. So how do you shop for books? Do you spend every waking hour in your local bookstore carefully comparing blurbs before making an educated decision? Or do you work, eat, and sleep like the rest of us? In today's time-poor society, a book's success depends on its cover more than many authors like to admit. You may have written a modern-day War and Peace, but in order for it to be read, you must first catch a shopper's eye. Damonza.com has built a reputation for doing just that. Their eye-catching, award-winning book covers have helped many self-published authors become New York Times and Amazon bestsellers. Their custom cover design packages start at just $495, come with a 100% satisfaction guarantee, and have a first draft turnaround time of just 14 days. You'll get a cover you love at a great price and in a quick time. So if you're ready to make your book awesome, visit damonza.com/authors. That's DAMONZA.com/authors. And enter the code AUTHORS to receive 10% off any of Damonza.com's self-publishing services. That's Damonza.com/authors and promo code AUTHORS for 10% off. And now I hope you enjoy today's topic, the 10-step checklist to writing an above-average novel. Anybody can write a novel. Writers sometimes hear that statement from dismissive non-writer family and friends. And rightfully, we dislike the insinuation, since we know full well how much education, talent, skill, effort, and dedication is required for anybody to write a novel. Still, there is a certain measure of truth in the idea that anybody can write a novel. An average novel, that is. A better than average novel, though, that's something else again. Or actually, is it? I believe every one of us has the opportunity to write not just a book, but something that rises above the pack to truly meaningful and impactful storytelling. But doing so starts by recognizing the common mistakes, pitfalls, and stereotypes that dog mediocre fiction. Now, a little personal background on this episode. For me, this year was one of major transitions, including a big move. And as a result of all the craziness going on in my outer life, I wasn't feeling too ambitious in my reading, although I did crack Proust. This year, I read a lot of what I call popcorn fiction. In other words, easy reads. And I was disappointed by almost all of it. The problem wasn't that these stories were lightweight. That's exactly what I wanted them to be. Rather, the problem was that they all suffered from unnecessary contrivances and cliches. And the most interesting thing was that, for the most part, they all suffered from the same contrivances and cliches, regardless of genre. Now, before someone comes back with the inevitable response that lightweight fiction need not be concerned with the finer nuances of great literature, let me put forth my absolute disagreement. We need good fiction. We need cerebral classics like Proust's monumental In Search of Lost Time. But we need good light fiction just as much. Indeed, light fiction has the opportunity to be tremendously impactful, if only because it is so accessible. Just as much as we need heavy-duty stories that offer complicated critiques of society, we also need simple stories of romance and adventure, and ones that are not dumbed down or sloppily presented. Entertainment and intellectualism should not exist at polar ends of the spectrum. The most intellectual fiction should optimally be the most entertaining, and the most entertaining of our stories should optimally be the most impactful. That's why today I've collated some straightforward solutions to the top 10 problems I noticed in quote-unquote average fiction this year. The primary antidote to almost all these problems is simple awareness. If you, as an author, can learn to spot these problems, analyze their existence in your own stories, and consciously work your way past them, you're well on your way to writing an above-average novel. Solution number 1, have a plot. This one should be obvious, especially to writers of genre books, but not so much, apparently. So, what is plot? That question, of course, is one we talk about a lot on this podcast, most recently in the episode How to Choose Your Story's Plot Points a couple weeks ago. But today I'm going to sum it up like this. Plot is a well-structured story with a cohesive point. Most genre stories at least pretend they have a plot. The boy and the girl fall in love, the space captain fights the aliens, etc. But too few execute that plot consciously on every page and every level of their story. That is, plot, character, and theme. Too many rely on random events and coincidences. For example, the boy and the girl just happen to keep bumping into each other around every corner, and this kind of thing strains suspension of disbelief. Solution number 2, give your characters strong goals and desires. The fastest route to a solid plot is via your characters' desires. What do these people want? I don't mean some general principle like love or peace, and I don't even mean just a plot goal. For example, kill those aliens. I'm talking about making sure every scene features a solid, driving, urgent desire and a resultant goal. Too often, writers let characters wander around aimlessly. For example, the depressed female lead is staring out over her favorite view of the Golden Gate Bridge again. Or the characters have only nominal goals. For example, the space captain is on a routine inspection. This can sometimes be because the authors didn't originally know what was going to happen next. Rather, they just turned the characters loose on the page and waited to see what happened. That's fine in the first draft, but the rambling needs to be cleaned up in subsequent drafts. Give every single character in every single scene a strong desire and a related goal, and then turn them loose on each other. Solution number 3. Make sure your characters spend more time doing stuff than talking about A, what they've already done, or B, what they're going to do. Whenever I find myself reading a needlessly wordy, rambling narrative in which nothing is actually happening, I often think of the wise words of Maddie Ross in True Grit. I'm not paying for talk. A character's internal narrative is important. Readers want to understand a character's inner landscape and inner process. In the hands of the right author, this kind of internal narrative can, in fact, make up the majority or even the entirety of the book, although never, I dare say, in genre fiction. However, it's important to note that characters who are interesting enough to move the story forward via large chunks of meaningful philosophizing are entirely distinct from characters who sit around rehearsing unnecessary information. Now, the greatest culprits of unnecessary information fall into the following 2 categories. Category number 1, backstory. Learning how to properly disseminate backstory information is an important and often tricky skill for authors. My rule of thumb is never share backstory until it is necessary to the plot. Until then, just drop delicious hints. But even if you have, in fact, waited until the perfect moment to share backstory, you must still be on guard against repeating it. One book I read this year spent what I estimate was fully a quarter of its word count having its protagonist either think about or talk about her tragic backstory. The same information over and over and over again. Category number 2, sequel scenes. Scene structure looks like this. We have the scene half, which includes goal, conflict, and outcome, and the sequel half, which includes reaction, dilemma, and decision. The sequel half of scene structure, in which characters react to previous events before deciding how to respond, is vital to a well-structured story. So much character development happens in these scenes. They are also vital to creating a sense of realism via an unbroken chain of cause and effect. However, it is far too easy to fall into the trap of using these scenes either to simply rehash the dramatic events that just happened or the characters' plans for what will happen. Both of these almost inevitably fall into the category of telling. And readers only need to be told once. And when you can show them, instead of telling them, always show them. Solution number 4. Ruthlessly chop dramatic subplots that only exist to create exciting climaxes. An oft-referenced screenwriting principle is that of creating an emotional B story to augment the plot's main A story. Now, although this approach offers some immediately practicable effects, I dislike its suggestion that there can be 2 stories. Bottom line, every piece of your story must contribute to the big picture of plot and theme. If any subplot doesn't do that, then it doesn't belong. Very often, genre stories will include a suspense subplot, which is commonly seen in romance novels, or a relationship subplot, which is commonly seen in action novels, both of which tend to matter very little, if at all, to the story's overall thematic presentation. That is problematic in itself. But when these decidedly minor subplots are then leveraged into the all-important limelight of the climax, just to provide an extra punch at the end, the story's overall cohesion fractures all the more. Solution number 5. Make your characters earn their romances. If your story features a romance, make sure you're representing it with realistic nuance. Create realistic relationships in which both people fight their demons in order to be together, in which both people make mistakes and suffer the consequences, in which both people have to earn their happiness together. Because seriously, I swear I'm gonna die if I read one more wish fulfillment romance in which some ridiculously hot but utterly vapid guy doggedly pursues a self-absorbed heroine just because she's the heroine. And of course, vice versa. Solution number 6. Give every character someone to talk to. What is the most interesting part of a story? Everybody's mileage is going to vary a little on this one, but I'll bet most of us would agree our favorite parts are where our characters get together and talk to each other. Dialogue is one of the most entertaining and most utilitarian aspects of any story. So much can be accomplished with good dialogue, everything from character development to plot advancement. But this only works when one character has another character to talk to. And it works so much better when the 2 characters doing the talking actually have a relationship of some sort, and therefore something at stake within the relational aspect of the scene. This seems like a no-brainer, but it's amazing how many books scatter their fantastic characters to the 4 corners of the globe, effectively preventing them from talking to each other for the entirety of their stories. So, just tell me this. Which would you rather read? A story in which the 2 best characters talk to each other regularly, or a story in which they don't? Put your best characters in a room together. If you can't do so for plot reasons, then it's time to create another interesting character. Solution number 7. Include only purposeful POVs. Point of view is a complex subject, so I'm not going to even get into basic principles and pitfalls such as avoiding head hopping. Rather, since this is an episode about how to make the jump from average fiction to above average, I'm going to talk about a one-up tactic. managing POVs to create an overall effect. In short, don't include scenes from random POV characters. Even those characters whose viewpoint you purposefully choose to use throughout the story need to be chosen to carefully present the plot to optimal effect. Recent trends aside, the best principle for above average POV usage remains the fewer, the better. Solution number 8, make sure all characters have agency. Something I've been thinking about a lot lately is the drama triangle, a social model that calls attention to the negative ramifications of casting ourselves and others in one or more of 3 relational roles: villain, victim, and hero. So many of our accepted narratives are hero-based. Somebody needs to be saved, so somebody else has to do the saving. Although this model certainly lives up to its name in providing drama, it also further ingrains social mindsets that are ultimately damaging. Recent decades have offered a lot of kickback against the presentation of female characters in the victim role of a damsel in distress who needs to be saved by a hero. I believe this idea should extend to all your characters. Naturally, it's only realistic to put certain characters in situations where they require aid and even rescue from other characters. But challenge yourself, as I'm currently trying to do myself, to make sure all characters have agency. All characters, even those most physically helpless, should be given responsibility for their own fates. It is phenomenal how much character development can result from just this simple mindset tweak. Solution number 9, play by your own rules. This one is important for all authors, but particularly for those writing multi-book series. Whether you're creating complex magic systems, or simply sharing a character's backstory, or even just applying foreshadowing hints in the first part of a story, you must be consistent. Readers trust you. They believe that what you tell them is so. If that turns out not to be the case, even if it's just the result of negligence on your part, the results can vary from a simple intellectual wrinkling of the nose to an emotional chucking of your book. Either way, it's not in anybody's interest. You made these rules for your story. It's only fair you follow them. And solution number 10, have style. You can get an A+ on all of the previous 9 principles of above average writing, but it probably won't matter if readers end up labeling your book bland. Truly memorable stories are usually less memorable for what they share than they are for how they share it. This doesn't necessarily mean you need a gimmick, but it does mean you need panache. This starts with creating charismatic characters, moves on to find its foundation in solid control over every structural decision, and ends with a distinctive narrative voice. Ultimately, being able to write an above-average novel requires nothing more than the commitment to keep learning what an excellent story looks like and doesn't look like. Keep your writerly brain turned on whenever you read a new book. Take note of what works for you, what doesn't, and how you can employ those lessons in your own fiction to strengthen the best bits and eliminate the weak parts. And here's to each of us writing our personal best story in the coming year. And tell me your opinion. What is a common pitfall you've noticed in novels you read this year? And why do you think it kept these books from being as good as they might have been? If you'd like to join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com, where you can also find a transcript of the most recent podcast. You can add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And if you are looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column, or if you're on a smaller screen such as a mobile device, you'll find it at the bottom of the site. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on iTunes. And if you'd like to support Helping Writers Become Authors, I would totally appreciate it if you'd consider taking the time to leave a quick rating or review on iTunes. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.